Well, good luck on your maiden voyage.
Yes, thank you. Indeed. Okay, let's give it a minute here. Okay, Mr. Producer, can we begin? Hello and welcome, everybody. I hope everyone's having a good evening. I'd like to welcome you on the first episode of the Heretics channel on Votum TV. We're broadcasting from Poland, and tonight we have a very special guest, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who you were introduced to with his bio at the beginning of our episode. I think to a lot of our viewers, Colonel Macgregor is a very well-known persona, especially in light of the situation that's taking place in Ukraine, but not only. Colonel Doug, it's an honor to have you on our program. How are you?
Oh, great.
Perfect. We'll jump right into it. In light of the situation that took place in Poland with the rocket attack from Ukraine, I want to start off with quoting two tweets that appeared yesterday and today on Twitter. The first one is from a Ukrainian channel that claims to be associated with the Euromaidan movement. And the second one is by a Polish journalist. So the first one states, Poles today choose between shame or war. But even if they choose shame, war will surely knock on their door. Proven by history. Poland can win only by fighting together with Ukraine against Russia, all other options end in the destruction of Poland. And the second tweet is by a Polish journalist, Michał Szudrzyński, who claims, I quote, it would be a bad thing if the tragedy in Przewodów led to a weakening of support in Poland for Ukraine. Such tragedies will not occur only if Russia ends its unauthorized and internationally illegal aggression against Ukraine. Let's support Ukraine, end quote. Doug, how do you respond to those two tweets?
Well, I certainly support mutual understanding and cooperation between Poles and Ukrainians. But I don't support the notion that Russia currently is a Soviet-like enemy that has to be fought at all costs. I don't see any evidence that Moscow is interested in attacking NATO. It's certainly not interested in attacking the West. And I think this entire conflict could have been avoided had we simply recognized Moscow's legitimate interests in what happens in Ukraine. Ukraine is a neighbor of Russia. What happens in Russia is important to Ukrainians. What happens in Ukraine is important to Russians. So we could have intervened early on and said, let's have a ceasefire and talk. In fact, we could have listened to the Russians over the last 10, 20 years about their concerns with what was happening inside Ukraine. And I think now we see with this Zelensky regime, a very dangerous government that is incurably hostile to Russia, that responds exclusively to instructions from Washington, that has decided that it wants to fatally weaken Russia in any way possible. The whole thing has backfired, obviously. Russia is actually economically and financially stronger today than it was when the intervention began. I would argue it's becoming stronger with each passing hour militarily. So the solution to this is not to join this futile and pointlessly destructive war with Moscow. is to get some sense into people's minds in the government in Kiev. And the last thing that Warsaw ought to do is join this thing. Warsaw should offer its services to broker an end to this destructive conflict. That's really where Warsaw could play the role of a great power.
Right. So it's very important, I think, to highlight the military dimension of this. And I think you're the perfect guy, the go-to guy for this, because ever since the beginning of the war, we've had high-level Polish military, ex-military officials saying that, it's only a matter of time before Russia runs out of missiles. Russians have to be stealing military equipment from Ukrainians that they don't have their own. They're a rump post-Soviet army. So, Doug, I want you to sort of take our viewers through a sort of obviously summarized tour de force of the military situation in Ukraine, with special emphasis on what happened in Kherson lately, because we're seeing a lot of different interpretations. The West is saying the Russians got routed, while the Russians are saying, no, it was just a tactical withdrawal, and we're going to come back, and we're going to come back soon.
Well, let's go back to the beginning and understand that the military establishment that Putin and his government built in the last 15 to 20 years was designed preeminently to simply defend Russia. It was not designed for offensive warfare against any neighbors. And I think we failed to see that the reduction in the size of the force and the change in its orientation meant something very different from what existed in Soviet times or even in the Tsarist period. He went in, that is, Mr. Putin went into eastern Ukraine with a set of assumptions that were not valid, but at the time he thought they were. He said, we don't want to kill civilians. We don't want to destroy infrastructure. In fact, we want to wage a very limited campaign because our principal interest is in eradicating these radical elements in the East, putting an end to the hostile force that is being built up by the United States and NATO in eastern Ukraine, and come to some sort of agreement that would allow for the equal representation before the law for the rights of Russians living in Ukraine. He thought, well, we're fighting a brother Slavic country, and we don't want this to last any longer than absolutely necessary. And I think he believed that he would have a serious negotiating partner in Kiev and in Washington. He was wrong. Everything has now changed. It began changing in the summer. Decisions were made in August about how they would approach the rest of this campaign. And now we're looking at a force of almost 700,000 troops surrounding Ukraine. The large probability of offensives beginning sometime over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 weeks, whenever the ground freezes completely and the Russians judge their force to be ready. And they will move in and they will finish off this Ukrainian state. Let's not kid ourselves. The regime in Kiev is likely to be annihilated along with the remainder of its armed forces, which over time have become more and more radicalized, to the point where now these so-called Azov Nazis and their supporters are not only murdering Russians, they're murdering their own people. And as we saw recently, they actually set out to kill Polish troops that were serving in Ukrainian uniform in Ukraine. This thing is gone badly. The Russians have been running out of munitions, I guess, from day one, according to the propaganda, and the Ukrainians are still on their victory march. Well, that's all nonsense. The Russians are now fully mobilizing to complete this task. The biggest mistake we could make in the West is to involve ourselves. We've done enough damage. And I think what we're going to see is exactly what I described, the total destruction of this rump Ukrainian state. Now, what happens afterwards? I don't know. I'm quite confident the Russians do not want to remain in Western Ukraine. That is the Ukrainian heartland. That's where the real Ukrainians live. Russians aren't interested in that. The Russians will likely withdraw to the Dnieper River. But as far as Kherson is concerned, Kherson is part of this thing called Novorossiya, which was always Russian. Odessa was founded by Russians, although you could give some credit to Germans, who were certainly in service to Catherine the Great, who had a role in building a lot of these cities, along with some Englishmen, Scots, and Dutch, let's be frank. But the bottom line is it was always Russian. It was never, quote unquote, Ukrainian. The Ukrainian heartland is further north above the Black Sea. The Russians are going to recapture Kherson, and the Russians are going to retake Kharkov. These are historically Russian cities. But the Russians are not interested in the rest of it. I just hope that the Ukrainians allow for some sort of emergence of a new government with a new, fresh attitude so that we can bring this thing to an end, because frankly, we've let the world down in Washington. This is the first time in our history, certainly since the Second World War, that we have not immediately intervened to end a conflict that would involve Russia. We have always worked tirelessly to find a way out of conflict with Russia. Never before have we had a government that sought conflict with Russia. And the tragedy, of course, is that we've subsidized and built up this tremendous force in eastern Ukraine that was first destroyed, and we've continued to build up whatever is left. And the principal victims are, of course, Ukrainians. They're dying in great numbers. Poles need to understand this. The way forward is not war with Russia.
So, in your opinion, the statements by many that it's just a little bit more time and a little bit more weaponry will change the situation. That's all that's needed: more time and more weapons, as Zelensky continues to ask for.
If you look at the strikes, the pattern of strikes that have begun, certainly since General Surovikin took over, they're very different from what we saw previously. In Russia, people were asking in the first months, why haven't you done damage to the bridges? Why haven't you attacked the transportation network? Why haven't you attacked the electric grid, the energy system? Why haven't you gone after all of the Ukrainian military installations? On and on and on. Well, those things are now happening. Ukraine can no longer manufacture any rocket fuel. It's being destroyed. Ukraine is running out of diesel. Ukraine cannot maintain the cities because the power is gone. This is going to continue until really the Ukrainian people are starving, freezing, and hopeless. And then the Russian offensive will begin, and it will be devastating. But they are now treating Ukraine as a real enemy. Previously, they did not. And this is not understood in the West.
What do you say to the energy infrastructure of Ukraine tantamount to a war crime? To me, it would seem that if you look at, for example, the strategic air campaign that was done before the ground troops, and you personally went into Iraq in '91, I mean, it seems to be part of the rules of war. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. And during World War II, the United States Air Force, probably the single most important task that the U.S. Air Force completed was the destruction of the fuel system that essentially made the Wehrmacht dangerous. By the time the Soviets launched Operation Bagration in June, or on or about June 24th, 1944, the Germans had no fuel to speak of. In other words, their aircraft had 2 hours of fuel before they had to shut down and land. When you went on the ground, everything was horse-drawn, not simply because the Germans hadn't fully modernized. They no longer had fuel. They were pulling artillery with horses, and the tanks only had perhaps a day and a half of fuel. This is where Ukraine is now. This is by design. We did it to the Germans. We did it again in the Balkans to the Serbs. This is not a war crime. This is a prudent measure that anyone would take in war. So we're watching the Russians doing exactly what we have done or what we would do.
Right. Going in a broader sort of historical context now, because we know that Putin has been saying from the very beginning that most of this has to do with NATO expansion, or at least stopping NATO expansion. Now, in the late 90s, I know you were in SHAPE headquarters in Brussels. You knew General Wesley Clark. In hindsight, and taking into account the opinion of a lot of other esteemed American statesmen like the late George F. Kennan, and I'm asking this as a poll, which might seem like a paradox to many of our viewers, but I think if you evaluate it in terms of consequences, you have to ask these questions. In your opinion, was NATO expansion in 1999 and the later NATO expansions prudent moves on the part of the United States?
No, I don't think it was. And when I was there, this question came up, and there were lots of interesting discussions. And I had the privilege of talking privately to very senior officers in the German military. And I asked them point blank, how do you feel about this? And they all believed strongly that NATO's purpose in Europe was to prevent another war in Europe. That's what they believed. And I said, well, does bringing Poland into NATO help or harm that purpose? And they were convinced that, given what had happened to Poland in the past, bringing Poland into the NATO fold, into this Western alliance, was something that they absolutely were obligated to do to help Poland. And when the question came up, well, what about Polish interest in lands lost during the Second World War? Well, the German attitude was, well, we've come to terms with the losses of territory that we had. I'm sure the Poles will too. Well, at the time, I heard different things from the Poles, and I certainly heard different things from the Hungarians, who continued to talk about the lands of the Crown of St. Stephen. But that was the attitude on the European side. Now, when you move to the American side, there was no thought about history, culture, religion, language, nothing. The American leadership didn't care about any of that. In other words, what Polish Lithuania had been, whatever the Kingdom of Prussia had been, whatever the Kingdom of Hungary was, whatever the Habsburg Empire was, none of that made any difference. There was no willingness to look back to the roots, the origins of people, and understand their interests. And they said, what we are doing is that we are pressing forward in support of a quote unquote democratic revolution that eventually is going to reach Moscow. Well, I remember hearing this and I looked at them and I said, what sort of hallucinogenics are you taking? What about the people that live in these countries? What about their interests? Oh, well, they don't matter. They're going to be happy in this utopian democracy of perfect diversity. It was completely irrational, and that was the American perspective.
Right. I think we have a little bit of a breakup, but if you can hear me, Doug, just confirm. Okay. Yep, I can hear you. Okay. So in this context, I think it's a question, because I don't think any Cold War president, from Truman to Reagan, would ever contemplate that the United States would be on the brink of war, potentially nuclear war, over whether Ukraine would join NATO. I don't think them ever contemplate such a situation.
It's impossible. But again, what the Europeans thought and what the Americans thought were very different. It was a dramatic divergence of opinion and perception there. Your audience needs to understand that. And I think what has happened is something that I forecast back in January when I had a conversation online with Dimitri Simes in Washington. And I said, I think if this thing lasts for more than a few months, this will destroy NATO. And I think that's well underway, especially since, as you know, I'm very well connected in Germany, and the things I hear from the Germans are frightening. I think by destroying the Nord Stream connection to Russia, and then ultimately with this war that we've done everything in our power to expand in Ukraine, the Russians are prepared, the Germans are prepared to walk away from us. I think what will happen now is we'll see some sort of restoration or rapprochement between Moscow and Berlin on the scale of what we've seen historically. And that was supposedly something everybody said they wanted to prevent. So now it's going to happen, absolutely. And there are lots of Germans who are very upset with the Polish government that continues to beat the drums for war. The Germans don't understand why. And I continue to ask why. I ask all the time when people say, well, isn't this a good thing? We're weakening Russia. Russia's an enemy state. I said, really? I said, Russia is no longer the Soviet Union. Is Russia massing armies to invade Western Europe? No, of course not. What is Russia doing that it deserves to be destroyed? And I never get an answer. Well, they're bad. They're anti-democratic. Well, a lot of the world is anti-democratic and always has been and probably always will be. It's an unfortunate set of circumstances. And I think the Poles, to a large extent, have fallen into this trap. And they need to get out of it. They need to see they need to establish their interests. What is Poland's interest? Does it really coincide with what this government in Kiev wants? Is that what they want? Are they unified? Are they on the same side, striving for the same things? I don't think so.
think a lot of our audience would agree. Doug, just going back to what the former CIA director, General Petraeus, said a few weeks back, there was talk of a coalition of the willing, as you well know, that there might be some small force outside of official NATO going into Ukraine, the Romanians, the Poles, and the American 101 Airborne. I know you've discussed this in your previous interviews. Have you heard anything new on this? Were we seeing any new developments, or has that been sort of backtracked now in light of what happened with the accidental, supposedly, rocket attack on Poland from the Ukrainian side?
I think for the moment it's on the shelf. And I think that's part of the reason that General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, leaked his comments to the New York Times, which incidentally he has now contradicted and walked back. People don't understand that the four-star that you pick to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is inevitably someone who's picked not for demonstrated character, competence, or intelligence, but for his willingness to say or do whatever the politicians want. It's unfortunate, but that's the truth. And I think he was becoming very concerned, because I don't know of anybody at the top of the U.S. military who thinks it would be a good idea for U.S., Polish, and potentially some Romanian forces to stagger into Western Ukraine. If they do that, we will be at war with Russia. And the real question is, why? Why would we want to go to war with Russia? And I think most people inside the Department of Defense have said, well, we don't. We're not prepared for it. A friend of mine who is in the French army, or was, he's a retired general now, said, Doug, the French army has 4 days of ammunition. The only thing the French army is prepared to do is go on safari in North Africa. Well, that describes most of the armies in NATO. The question is, how much do we have on hand? We know that our war stocks have been severely depleted in order to supply the Ukrainians. Ukrainians are firing on average 7,000 artillery rounds a day. The Russians are firing 20,000. The Russians are not running out. They're not going to run out. And their industry is fully geared up. And now this mobilization has continued. So, I mean, we're dealing with one side that is unambiguously mobilized and postured to fight, and our side, which isn't. So naturally, people have said this coalition of the willing is a bad idea. This is behind the scenes. And why do we have a coalition of the willing? Because most of NATO is not interested in this. Most of NATO doesn't want to do it. If you go to Spain or Italy or Portugal or Greece, even France, behind the scenes, people say it's ridiculous. Well, then why do we go along publicly? Well, because people want to be friends with the United States. But we've pushed this to the extreme. And I think at some point people are going to say, well, the hell with Washington. You know, this is not really in our interests. I think we're very close to that. It's unfortunate, because this was not what we wanted when we set out.
Right. It's good that you mentioned Milley, because during his, I think it was a recent press conference, he stated very adamantly that the United States military, in the shape that it's in, is going to remain number one. Nobody's going to surpass the Americans. Now, a lot of the belief in Poland in NATO vis-a-vis Moscow rests on the assumption that there's no way, having the United States behind us, that anybody can do us any harm. And so having that foundation of your viewpoint, you tend to want to provoke the Russians, because you know that Uncle Sam has your back. I think you're very well informed on the state of the United States Armed Forces, and I'd like you to tell the Polish audience, especially listening right now, what can we expect from the American side, if, God forbid, a shooting war begins?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that we will probably always spend more money than everyone else. Unfortunately, money spent does not equal military capability achieved. And that's not widely understood. Our forces are actually quite small. We have an inexhaustible quantity of generals and admirals, but we have relatively few people who actually fight. And that's a problem. We're having enormous difficulties recruiting for this army that would have to carry the burden in a war with Russia. We can't maintain more than about 475,000 people in the army, and of that number, perhaps 150,000 or 160,000 actually fights. If you tried to mobilize the National Guard or the reserves, you're going to run into a lot of opposition. they've been abused and mismanaged, in my judgment, for the last 22 years of conflict in the Middle East. People are tired, they're worn out, and they're exhausted. But here's something that's much more important than any of this. First of all, neither we nor the Russians want to use nuclear weapons. Obviously, the Russians don't need them. They can accomplish their goals without them. I hope that we are no longer considering any use under any circumstances. The president unwisely signed a document which effectively backed away from our de facto no first use pledge. I think that was a mistake. If we were to resort to the use of nuclear weapons, everything would escalate quickly and civilization as we know it would be extinguished. So that brings us back to the high-end conventional level. What can we do? Well, things have changed since 1945, and your audience needs to understand this. The links between overhead surveillance, space, terrestrial, at sea, whatever, to standoff attack weapon systems that are precise, that have the microcircuitry and the technology to ensure that when you launch, say, a caliber cruise missile with a large 1,000 kilogram warhead, that you can launch it from Russian territory and it will strike a target in Lisbon, Portugal with great accuracy. And you can launch hundreds, if not thousands of them all over Europe. If we move to the Atlantic, Russian submarines will end up obstructing the movement of any US forces trying to reinforce our position on the continent. This is not 80 years ago or 85 years ago. This is today. We are limited in what we can do, even if we want to do it, which is why President Trump tried to make the argument that the Europeans must be their own first responders. In other words, if you're betting on our timely arrival, you're making a mistake, because it's too easy technologically today for any great power to interfere with the movement of forces and resupply from the United States to Europe. So we can't do what we did in the 1940s, which is essentially spend 2 years defeating the German submarine threat before we finally reached Europe. That won't work. Certainly it's not going to work with the Russians. But again, the Russians know this. They're not interested in a war with us. They really want to do business with us. They'd like to do business with Germany. I think they'd like to do business with Poland. We've got to get rid of this poisonous atmosphere that does nothing but cultivate hatred and hostility on the basis of attitudes and ideas that no longer fit in the modern era. We've got to get past these old wounds, these old frustrations. It doesn't mean we forget. It doesn't mean that we don't honor the sacrifices of the people that preceded us. But we have to live in this world today with a different set of people and get on with it. And I think that's something that this administration has failed to do. It has tried to drag us all back into the Cold War. Most Americans don't want to go there. I certainly don't.
Right. It's good that you mentioned Trump. From public records that you had dealings with the former president. Vic Bond recently stated that if Angela Merkel were still in power and Donald Trump was still in the White House, this war probably would not have taken place. From your vantage point, how do you think Trump would have dealt with the situation as it progressed, at least starting in December of last year when Putin proposed those security guarantees for Russia?
Well, first of all, I think Mr. Orban is giving far too much credit to Angela Merkel. I don't see her as having done anything that I would seriously regard as positive in Germany. And more Germans are seeing her tenure as a period of serious decay. And eventually, I think they will see her as having betrayed German national interests. So let's just forget Angela Merkel. I think Donald Trump was saddled with a number of people who were always opposed to him. I don't need to explain that to most of your viewers, but let's be frank. He appointed people to office who set out from day one to sabotage and subvert him. But if he had still been president when this got started, as you say, in December of last year, I think it's an absolute certainty that Donald Trump would have immediately called the president of Russia and asked for a meeting and asked to talk with him and find out what it is precisely that he has to have. And to be frank, I think he would have accepted neutrality for Ukraine immediately. He was never terribly enthusiastic about NATO as an offensive weapon. Remember, he, much like the Europeans, thought that NATO was this defensive alliance. He wasn't terribly excited about bombing the Serbs in the Balkans and intervening there. He wasn't terribly excited about dragging the Europeans into Afghanistan and Iraq or Libya. So I think he would have immediately arranged some sort of ceasefire and asked for a meeting. And I think out of that would have come some sort of agreement. And frankly, he would have told the Ukrainians, or this regime, I hate to say Ukrainians because I really don't believe Zelensky represents all Ukrainians, to be blunt. If he had he would have turned to Zelensky and said, look, if you're going to persist in this war with Russia, you're going to do it on your own. We won't support that. So I think things would have been different, yes.
Taking into consideration that, as we learned late yesterday, the Republicans actually have taken the House by a slim majority. Where do you see American public support going in the next few weeks in terms of the war in Ukraine? Are we going to see the support falling? Will it be maintained? How do you think the situation will evolve in terms of American public opinion and potential pressure on the newly elected Congress and further on the president?
I think your audience needs to understand that if you look at the top 10 priorities for the average American citizen, I'm not even sure Ukraine makes the list. The problem that we have is that certainly for the last 30 years, certainly in the aftermath of Desert Storm in the 1990s, it really gets off the ground under Bill Clinton, but you could argue that Bush starts it with his intervention in Somalia, which everyone warned him against, including General Powell. Americans are not interested in these interventions anywhere. And as a result, the interventions persist because donors buy up support on the Hill, and people on the Hill think that they benefit from this, both financially, which is true, and secondarily because they can then posture and say, look how powerful we are. There are, unfortunately, Americans who are confused that think when we bomb someone somewhere, that makes us look great. It doesn't. But there are stupid people who think that way. So I think that's the problem. And now Ukraine is this place somewhere far away. The money is being spent, and this is more money adding to a $31 trillion national sovereign debt that most people don't truly understand. And they're watching the interest rates rise. They're watching inflation increase. They're watching the breakdown in the rule of law in our cities and along our borders. They're watching the invasion of this country by millions of people from the developing world, primarily Latin America. And they're saying, what are we doing in Ukraine? Why aren't those troops protecting our borders? Why aren't we stopping the criminality? Why are we not addressing the issue of economic prosperity? Why are we not doing, as President Trump wanted to do, repatriating manufacturing back to the United States? This crowd in Washington is very good at distracting people. Say, oh, well, China is the new Soviet threat. Oh, Russia is a new Soviet threat. ISIS is a new global threat. You know, I keep asking people, what happened to the global caliphate? Nobody has an answer. It went away, I guess. Well, of course not. We all know that there's still problems in the Islamic world. But the whole issue was, how do we improve the situation by involving ourselves in it? And the answer is we don't. So I think that the American people aren't the problem. The problem right now is in the Hill. It's the Senate and the House, where people are responding to donors. I was asked this morning by a prominent journalist, why do people do these things? I said, find out who the donors are. Find out how much money is pouring into these politicians' pockets for their reelection, for their sustainment in office. You will answer your question. The average American is not sending millions of dollars to Washington. So where does this come from? And I think this is all going to come together somehow. You look at the FTX disaster that involves this phony digital coinage and the individual who was involved with that, who was obviously a big supporter of Mr. Zelensky. What a shock. And Zelensky is investing money that they've got in Kiev with him. What a shock. And now we find out that this makes Enron look like a sideshow. We're not even sure how many hundreds of billions of dollars have been lost in this enterprise. But who was benefiting on the Hill? You have as many people on the Republican side involved in this as you do on the Democratic side, which is why we refer to this as a uniparty. So the way to sum up is this. Will the attitudes in America change things in Washington? Yes, but not immediately. This will drag on until it becomes unambiguously clear that the Russians have crushed the opponent. And I think that's what Moscow has figured out. They don't have much choice. They don't have a real negotiating partner. And anything that would be on offer would be treated with great suspicion. As a Russian at this point, I would be very reluctant to believe anything we said.
Right. Just one final question, because there's a lot of talk, obviously, coming out of the summits that have been taking place, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the new BRICS structure. We know a lot of countries are putting in applications to join. We've heard of Turkey, we've heard of Saudi. Just to end off as a last opinion from your great mind on this, a lot of people are poo-pooing, so to say, Eurasia and the BRICS organizations, that, they're never going to be any sort of competition for the United West, the West. But we're seeing more and more capital, we're seeing more and more people, we're seeing more and more technological and military potential taking place in the East, not in the West, which has become a very deindustrialized zone, to say the least, and it's basically committing Europe demographic and economic suicide as we speak. So what do you think is the trajectory of Eurasia vis-a-vis the collective West, and also taking into consideration what's happening in Ukraine? Is the East going to be a strong competitor, or is the East on its way to becoming a hegemon?
First of all, the institutions that support Western financial power and ultimately American financial domination are not reproducible in the East. In other words, building up the system and the various institutions that support our financial dominance will take a while. Now, I have no doubt that they're going to try. I also think that at some point they will succeed. We were always viewed as trustworthy. In other words, who do you want to trust your money to? Well, people were ready to entrust their money to us. We are now seen as unreliable, or at least as deceitful. And there is a tendency in much of the world to back away from us. People, for instance, don't understand that if you look at the World Bank, we have effectively used that to bully nations into growing crops that we wanted them to grow versus the crops they wanted to grow. Now, this may seem like a minor thing, but not if you live in those countries. I think people around the world are tired of being bullied by us. And of course, added to this is the transfer of our enormous debt through dollar-based commerce to them. When does this all break down? When does it all change is anybody's guess. Not quickly. Not in the next 6 months, probably not in the next year. But eventually, absolutely. I think the so-called Rubicon has been crossed. And Russia will have a role in this, but Russia is not delusional. They know they're not going to be the global power that drives it. And, contrary to popular belief, the Chinese that want to make money are not terribly excited about replacing us. It's a much more mixed bag, but ultimately, I don't think any of them have much choice. India, China, Russia, much of the developing world, the Middle East and Asia, I think they're going to turn away from us. Now, of course, we could change. We could throw these people out, give up this sort of permanent bid for military hegemony around the world, which we use to intimidate and bully people. But in the short run, I don't see it happening.
Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Douglas Macgregor was our guest this evening. And I want you to do one thing when you end off on our interview today. I want you to Google FTX, as Colonel Macgregor said, a very important player in the last couple of months, as you will see. And I think a lot of developments will come from that investigation. So, Doug, thank you once again for being our guest today on our inaugural program of the Heretics channel on Votum FM. We're hoping you soon, possibly as soon as possible, depending on the situation, which is very volatile and it could explode any moment. Hopefully, it doesn't in Eastern Europe. But once again, thank you very much. And I think I speak for all of us when we say God bless and hope to see you again soon.
Do widzenia.
Do widzenia.